I'm starting the recording, and we will start with Dr. Enns' presentation, and if everybody's on mute, and then we'll have questions at the end.
That sounds good. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Oh, good. This is terrific. So I'm not going to take too long, but I was asked to just go through the trials that are currently ongoing with highlighting 3 in particular, and I'll discuss one just in brief. So these are organic acidemia clinical trials, and I'm going to focus on methylmalonic and propionic acidemia. I think everybody in this audience knows these conditions pretty well, so I'm not going to really spend much time there, but just as a reminder, they are cousins. They're in the next, they're neighbors in the biochemical pathway that involves certain amino acids and fatty acids. As such, some of the therapies that I'm going to be discussing make sense to go after both of these conditions together. So just as a start, I'm sure that Dr. Vockley will have other terms to include as he goes over his overview of clinical trials as a whole, but I'm going to be using some of these terms just when I describe these clinical trials. So a biomarker, commonly used, it's a biological marker, it's a contraction of that term. And it means that there are biological markers of a disease. I think you're all familiar with methylmalonic acid being a marker of methylmalonic acidemia. 2-methylcitric acid is another one, as is 3-hydroxypropionate, which can be elevated in both the conditions. So these are just chemicals that are in the body that will be followed by some of these clinical trials. And you'll note that when I describe the trials, I'll mention things called pharmacokinetics or pharmacodynamics. And quite simply speaking, pharmacokinetics is what the body does to the drug or the therapy. So typically when you're doing an experimental treatment, the investigators or the people who are doing the study want to learn how that drug is metabolized in the body, so they can take multiple measurements, for example, in blood to see how it's absorbed or distributed through the body. Pharmacodynamics, on the other hand, is a little bit different. It's what the drug or the treatment does to the body. So we're hoping that these types of therapies that I'll be describing will have a good overall effect on our patients. And we want to see lower MMA levels, for example, or lower ammonia levels, or increased activity, decreased hospital stays, those sorts of things. That's pharmacodynamics. That's what the drug or the therapy is doing to the person or the individual who's enrolled in the trial, and it relates to clinical outcomes. Oftentimes, trials will, of course, have a limited time frame. So it's quite commonly that a trial will be 3 months, 6 months, or even a year long. But what happens after that year? And after that year, it's very common for the companies or the sponsors of a clinical trial to have an extension study tagged on. And what that means is after the clinical trial is over, if an individual or if a participant wishes to continue in that trial, they're able to do so as part of a long-term extension. They will get the treatment, they'll get the therapy if it's a repeatedly given therapy, for example, as a long-term extension. So the first to discuss is HST 5040. This is under development by Hemoshear Therapeutics, and it is aimed at both methylmalonic and propionic acidemias. It's a liquid that can be taken orally or through a G tube, and it's meant to distribute throughout the body. So it has been shown to distribute throughout the kidneys, liver, brain, heart, and muscles, and it has been well tolerated in studies to date. It's aiming basically at the balance of what's called the coenzyme A pool, in order to bring back a metabolic balance that is altered in propionic and methylmalonic acidemias. The study is looking for 12 patients who have methylmalonic or propionic acidemias and is aimed at children 2 years of age and older. These individuals need to have evidence of some inadequacy in their metabolic control, for example, a high ammonia, a high MMA level, or hospitalization because of their illness within the past 4 years. The study design is in 3 parts. Initially, the first part, everybody participating takes the study medication, starting with a low dose and then increasing gradually at 4-week intervals. Following that, it's a random assignment to 2 different groups. One takes the study drug for 3 months. The other takes what's called a placebo, or a non-drug or a non-active compound for 3 months. And this is a crossover study so that the individuals switch over. Part C is following the analysis of what's going on in parts A and B. An optimal dose will be decided upon, and participants in the trial will take this study drug daily until it is approved by the FDA. They're thinking that the trial might expand to include transplanted patients and cobalamin A or B patients as well. So it goes by the name of HERO. It's called a phase 2 clinical trial, and I just described what it's going to be about. This is just some of the summary of the inclusion criteria. And here also lists the primary outcome measures. The first thing that will be looked at carefully is the change in 2-methyl citrate levels, which is a compound that's elevated in both these conditions. And a number of other biomarkers are going to be measured, and they're listed there. So pharmacokinetics, we're going to take measurements to see how that drug is metabolized throughout the body, et cetera. And some other things are going to be measured. For example, the number of decompensations or hospital visits, and quality of life measures are also going to be used. The next round is something that everybody is now familiar with throughout the world, messenger RNA therapies, with the event of COVID and COVID-19 now vaccinations. Moderna initially came out with a vaccine based upon messenger RNA technology, and it's a company that has used this technology to develop vaccines. I've been working with them and following their progress closely because I'm interested in using that same type of technology, not to make a vaccine or a COVID-19 spike protein, but to use it to make the missing enzyme, for example, methylmalonyl-CoA mutase or propionyl-CoA mutase. This is a cartoon taken from an early article on an animal study using messenger RNA to make the missing enzyme. So this is an infusion given into the bloodstream. The messenger RNA is coated in a lipid nanoparticle or a small fat droplet that makes its way to the liver. The messenger RNA is delivered to the liver cells and then goes ahead and makes the missing, in this case, enzyme. And the missing enzyme has an activity and should have an activity for several weeks. So this is not a definitive treatment, but it is a treatment that is like an enzyme replacement therapy that needs to have multiple infusions every about 3 weeks, it's thought. So the current messenger RNA study that is in line and ongoing in the United States is developed for propionic acidemia. There is a methylmalonic acidemia study that had, I think, started outside the United States, but I don't have further information on that specific trial. So today I'll talk about the propionic acidemia trial. This is looking for individuals who have propionic acidemia who are older than 1 year, seeking an estimated 36 participants. It's going to look at the safety of this treatment, pharmacokinetics or PK, pharmacodynamics or PD, of different doses of this messenger RNA therapy. So the primary outcome measure is not really related to a specific therapeutic outcome. It's investigating to make sure that this particular treatment is safe. So they're going to focus on the incidence of adverse events. But of course, while giving this treatment, they will look at how it's metabolized in the body, how the body responds to the therapy, and measures some outcome measures and biomarkers as well as listed on this slide. The last one that I'll go into in some detail is a gene therapy protocol that is focused on methylmalonic acidemia by the sponsor of Logic Bio. This is a form of what's called promoterless nuclease-free genome editing. And that's a handful, or a mouthful, I should say, of technology terms coming to fruition here. It's a gene therapy approach, meaning it's a single infusion of a technology that includes the missing code for the methylmalonic acid enzyme, or methylmalonyl-CoA mutase. This missing genetic code is carried by an adeno-associated virus vector, and it's meant to actually go into the DNA of an individual, and not just any DNA, but it's meant to insert directly next to what's called the albumin gene. The albumin gene is a gene that is very prominent in livers, and it's thought that by putting this gene next to the albumin gene in the body, that there will be lots of methylmalonyl-CoA mutase enzyme made, and that it's a relatively safe position because it's not randomly going into any part of the DNA in an individual's body. So this is going to look at the use of this vector in patients who are children. And the past studies have shown permanent liver correction in mouse models of methylmalonic acidemia, including improved biomarkers and improved survival. This is just a slide taken from a recent article showing that after treatment of animal models of methylmalonic acidemia, the enzyme production was robust and improved and increased in time. This dark area is a section of that's showing enzyme production in a cross section of a liver, and it's in a mouse model. So it's showing, in principle, this works well in animals, and it tends to get taken up in different spots in the liver and produces increased enzyme in those spots. The trial is called Sunrise, and the treatment is called HLB001, another catchy term. And it's, as I said, it's directed towards methylmalonic acidemia. It's primarily looking at safety and how patients tolerate, or I should say, individuals who are undergoing the therapy tolerate this intervention, and also looking at some outcome measures like the biomarkers that are commonly followed that we've been discussing, so methylmalonic acid levels, methyl citrate levels, etc. But is primarily interested in looking to make sure that this is a safe process and that there's no toxicity associated with this form of treatment. It's looking for about 8 individuals, ages 6 months to 12 years. This is just a little bit more detail showing the design of the trial. As is common with these types of clinical trials, it's not necessarily clear what the best dose of the viral vector to give is. The animal models provide investigators and scientists with some guidance towards this, but in order to really figure out what might work, they have to try different dosings in humans, and this is outlined here. This is a one-time treatment, and patients are followed for about a year, looking for about 8 patients to participate in this clinical trial. The trial is being performed throughout the United States. You can go on to the www.clinicaltrials.gov website to find locations, but it's also just shown in this slide. And finally, just something that is in the works. This is a study, and I thank Kathy for sending me this slide earlier today, that is being performed by CoA Therapeutics. This is another small molecule or a drug that is being designed to treat both propionic and methylmalonic acidemias, and is also targeting the coenzyme A pathway and hoping to restore a metabolic balance in the cells that will help with the enzymatic defects present in these conditions. The current study is going to be in healthy volunteers aged 18 to 55 years. It's the first early, what's called a phase 1 study. I'm sure Dr. Vockley will go into that in more detail. And hopefully, if it's shown to be safe in volunteers, this will be opened up to methylmalonic acidemia and propionic acidemia patients later on. So that's it. Those are the hot off the press updates. And just as a reminder, if you want to find out about any of these studies in more detail or contact a site that's performing a study close to you to find out more information, that information is held at this standard website, the www.clinicaltrials.gov. And with that, I will end and turn it over to Dr. Vockley.
Well, and maybe we'll have questions at the end if folks want to wait, unless I'm just wondering if you're going to jump off before Dr. Vockley, maybe.
Oh, true. Yes.
Open up a couple of, if there were anyone that had any questions, and you can unmute yourself. And if you have a question, my first question, I just got a quick one. When you speak of these clinical trials, they're just in the United States, correct? I mean, there are some
Correct.
open in other countries like Canada and the UK, but you're not speaking
Correct.
to those at all, right?
Right, and that's a great question. The clinicaltrials.gov website has information on clinical trials that occur throughout the world as well, but I'm focusing on the studies that are available in the United States.
But to be clear, some of the studies will allow international patients to come to the United States to participate in the trials. Of course, that's a lot of time on the part of the family and expense on part of the company. So those are decided on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks for the reminder.
Okay, and then Dr. Vockley, when you're going to talk about the clinical trial process, it could be, you're talking about the process in the United States, when they have to get approval. It's FDA approval for the United States, but if there's other approval, it's different. You're not going to speak to the approval process in other countries, are you?
It's similar enough that folks can look at the information that I'll be giving and apply it to local jurisdictions. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But it does need to be approved in every country before that country can use the drug. And
I'll shut up with my questions. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask Dr. Enns regarding the potential treatments that are coming up? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Since Dr. Enns and I both work at very liver transplant intensive institutions, I thought I might make one other comment, which is that the two CoA therapies, the HemoShear and the CoA Therapeutics one, those studies will be open sooner or later to patients who have had a liver transplant, PA and MMA patients who've had a liver transplant. If you've had a liver transplant, however, you've already had gene therapy, so you can't get gene therapy again, and you don't need the mRNA therapy. So those two trials are not open to folks with the liver transplants.
Well, that's good to know. There's options out there.
Dr. Vockley, I think you're up.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and start with you, Dr. Vockley.
All right. Let me get my screen ready here.
I'm going to put his bio in the comment section. Just, I'm sure everyone knows who you are, but Dr. Vockley, we have the pleasure of having him as our medical advisor, the organic acid medical advisor for over 20 years. And obviously he is a chief of medical genetics in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, at Children's Hospital of Pennsylvania. And I will put his bio in the comments so you can see everything about him.
Thanks. I always hate listening to my own bio. Much easier to read it. So let me grab the screen share here. And I do believe it will be this window. Let's try that. How's that look?
Yep, I can see it. Looks good.
Looks good.
All right. And hang on, let me grab a laser pointer here. I don't think it's working. I never. One of these days, we'll get back to live and not have to worry about these things. But we'll just keep going here. All right. So I'm going to not be talking about a clinical trial. I'm going to be talking about clinical trials, and that's the title of my talk: New Therapies for Rare Disease. How do we know what we know, and why should you care? If there are approved drugs, if you just took an antibiotic for a strep throat or something for your high blood pressure, or even had gone through something like chemotherapy for cancer, those are approved drugs, and the process for approving those drugs is quite rigorous because in the United States, it's the FDA that approves drugs. The FDA doesn't want you to take something that isn't effective and in fact could be dangerous. So how do we know that? Well, it's through a clinical trial. Why should you care? Well, if a drug isn't approved, then it's not available to you. Now, you just heard about clinical trials. That's how they get approved. So we're going to talk about that process, and hopefully by the end of this, for those of you who are with MMA or PA or family members, you'll look at the the 4 clinical trials that are currently available, and decide if one of those is appropriate for you or your family member to participate in. Here's my they call them disclosures. I call them opportunities. Companies that are willing to work on rare disease research funding or engage some of us to talk to them about these diseases. And we're going to start this exercise, this discussion with quiz. So here you go. Everybody's been talking on the internet about a new supplement. It's available over the counter from a variety of suppliers. Some families have tried it. It raved. It makes their kids feel better. It gives them more energy. Others have said, I don't think it really did so much. Doesn't seem to be much published information in the medical literature because you've done your PubMed thing. And so which of the following statements describes your feeling on this new supplement? All right, number 1, I have to try it because it might make a difference. Number 2, I'll do some more reading and I'll make up my mind about trying it after that. Number 3, I'll ask my doctor his or her opinion on trying the new supplement. The doctors know everything, right? Number 4, can't see how something like this will work, so I won't try it. Or number 5, I would be very interested in participating in a clinical trial. Oh, I forgot. I've got builds on this. Now, I don't think it'll be too surprising to you to know that I think the answer should be, I would be very interested in participating in a clinical trial. Well, why is that? Because it's the only way we know whether or not a drug works, unequivocally. I'm sure you've all heard of the placebo effect. You take a sugar pill and suddenly you feel great because you think you took something that was active. That's a very, very strong psychological tool. We use it sometimes in clinical medicine, but it's not what we want to see in clinical trials. So how do we know for sure that something is working? Well, that's called evidence-based medicine. What we want is to be able to look at the evidence in front of us and unequivocally state that evidence shows us the drug either does work or it doesn't work. And unless you design a clinical trial that makes it very clear that that's going to happen, what we have is not evidence. What we have are anecdotes. I tried it and, well, he tried it and. The plural of anecdote is not data. No matter how many people can give you their opinion, there's no way to know whether they're right or they're wrong. It's just how they feel about it. So we'll talk a little bit about levels of medical evidence, what it means to have medical evidence for or against something working. And then we'll talk a little bit about the clinical trial process. And hopefully by the time this is done, we'll be able to chat a little bit and talk about if you have any hesitancies about a clinical trial, why might that be, and how we might be able to help you feel comfortable with it. All right. So let's start off with talking about levels of medical evidence. Sorry about that. We go from the very highest level of evidence in a clinical trial, which is a randomized control study. Usually it's a study that includes comparison of the active medication against a placebo, but it doesn't have to. There are other ways to do those trials. And if you end up with level 1 evidence out of a study or a clinical trial, then that's the best evidence that you can have that something works, and it'll generally allow you to go to the FDA or the local regulatory agency in your country and ask for approval to market that drug commercially. Level 2 is still not bad, but it's not quite as good as level 1, as you might guess by the lower ranking. The first flavor of a level 2 medical evidence is a controlled trial, but without randomization. And so this means it's done very, very carefully. It might even be compared to a placebo, but it's not done with randomization. We'll talk about double-blind placebo-controlled trials later, which means that everybody is blinded to who is taking what. The investigators don't know, the patients don't know. And moreover, in the level 1, that's randomized. So the randomization algorithm spits out a number. That number ties to a bottle of medication, if you will, and that bottle of medication could be placebo, or it could be control, or it could be the medication in study, and that's what you get. There's a second type of level 2 study or medical evidence, and it's called a cohort or a case control study, and basically what that does is it tries to pull information out of a number of different studies. So these would be studies that were done by preferably different investigators at different sites, usually not related to one another. So this isn't a single study. And then you pull that all together and you say, on the whole, it all looks pretty good. It looks like it's working. Not as good as a randomized control, but sometimes it might pass muster based on or depending on the disease. Some of these diseases are so rare that it's hard to do a randomized control study. Oh, I'm sorry, I said 2 levels. The third level, the third subgroup of level 2 is more related to sort of real world intervention. So I have something I think works, and I use it on a bunch of patients. I give it to Dr. Enns because I've managed to convince Dr. Enns it might work, and he's going to try it on his patients, and he publishes or puts his observations out there in the medical literature. And eventually you get a bunch of these together, and on the whole, they look better than not. And once again, depending on the disorder, you might be able to get that kind of study approved, or at least it serves as one level of medical evidence for approval. Oh, Jerry, I'm getting calls from somebody who I should talk to, but I'll talk to them later. The flip side of that is something that's called a dramatic result in an uncontrolled trial. You might all know about Carbaglu. It's a drug that some of our PNMMA patients are on because it helps drop the ammonia. But it was meant to. It was originally developed as a therapy for a very, very rare form of another kind of disorder, a urea cycle disorder. And what it is it's a form of the metabolite that was supposed to be made that couldn't, and by that enzyme defect. And so if you give it to a patient with that enzyme defect, it bypasses the block. So it's like saying, I need to make 1 to make 2 to make 3 to make 4. But if you can't make 1, then you're stuck. But if we can give you 2, bypasses the block. Well, in that particular study, a very small number of patients, those patients, their ammonia levels normalized like instantly. It was dramatic. There was no question it was working. And that drug was approved for use in that disorder on very, very few patients treated. And then level 3 here is the one that ought to worry you. Opinions of respected authorities based on clinical experience, descriptive studies, or reports of expert committees. So if you ever hear Dr. Enns or me or any of your metabolic physicians say, well, I think this works, you should try it. That's opinion, and it's not fact. It's their observation. And sometimes it may be all we have. And if you get a whole bunch of us together, that's an expert committee or a panel, it might be enough to convince us that it works, but not necessarily. So you have to really be careful when we get down to level 3 of medical evidence. It's just not very strong. It may be the best we have for some of our rare diseases, but it's not very strong. Oh, here we go. I forgot the build again. One of these days, I'm just going to strip that out of there because I always forget about it. What do we do? How do we deal with these disorders and still allow our kids to grow up healthy? Kathy, these are my kids from when we lived in Minnesota.
I was going to say they're much older now, aren't they?
They're much older now, and there's a lot of snow on the ground, which we don't see in Pittsburgh. I can't get rid of this slide. I love this picture. It just reminds me of my many years in Minnesota, which I also love. But keep in mind that if you're getting ready to enter a maze and you have no idea how you're going to get through it, how to figure out whether something works or not. Well, sometimes just taking a different view of it will make things very clear. And so as we look at clinical trials in rare diseases, this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to come up with novel ways to evaluate the efficacy of a drug that won't take 10 years, which is what an average drug takes to come to clinical approval, and it won't take hundreds or thousands of patients because we just don't have that number of patients. We don't have that much time. All right, now I'm going to when you look at clinical trials or guidelines, for example, we take the medical evidence that's at hand, and that goes back to that level 1, 2, and 3, and we come up with recommendations. Now this really refers more to guidelines than clinical trials, but it's pertinent. And when the FDA looks at clinical trials, this is the kind of process that they're using. They may use a slightly different language, but it's still the same concept. When we talk about the preponderance of evidence in a clinical trial or something that we're trying to put into a treatment guideline, for example, we talk about level A evidence or the top level of evidence. And that's strong evidence that benefits substantially outweigh the potential risks. Start working down to level B, fair scientific evidence that the benefits outweigh the potential risks. Not as strong, but we might have to make our decisions based on the less evidence, because that's what we have available for. And then level C is a toss-up. We just can't tell. On balance, between the benefits and the risks, it's just too close for making a general recommendation. What you don't want to come out with is level D, which says that risks outweigh the potential benefits. Of course, that would have been stopped as a clinical trial, and in a treatment guideline, you'd say, well, I'm not going to, just don't do that. There's an indeterminate level that sometimes gets called level I, which just simply says there's lack of evidence. We cannot tell. Not that one is better than the other. We just can't tell from the evidence available. You got to do more work to do that. Oh, there's my build again. So when we look at the clinical trials, the whole goal of a clinical trial is to try to get the best medical evidence possible to give us the ability to make the best recommendations possible, and then in the end bring a drug either to clinical use, commercial marketing, or say, I'm sorry, it's just not good enough. You either have to abandon it or you have to go back and do more studies. So let's talk about the phases of a clinical trial. You'll hear this pretty ubiquitously. There's the language of clinical trials, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and we'll come to phase 4 in a second, are pretty widespread. In a phase 1 trial, you heard Dr. Enns talk about safety rather than efficacy. These are often drug metabolism focused, so it's just trying to figure out how the drug is metabolized in the body. There may be some dose ranging studies to try to figure out what the right dose is. And oftentimes you'll see it in healthy volunteers, because even though the drug may not be treating anything in them, their body is still metabolizing it the same way as somebody who has a particular disease. So oftentimes this will be used the healthy volunteers. Now, when you're talking about gene therapy trials or those mRNA trials that Dr. Enns mentioned, you will not see that done in a healthy volunteer because it's just too invasive to give to a healthy volunteer. And so in that case, we start right in the affected population, the individuals with the disease, but with built-in safety. So usually a dose is a little bit lower. In this case, it will be, instead of blinded, it might be open labels so that you can actually follow the patients and know what you're doing. And you'll be treating them in ways that might mitigate any side effects that you're worried about. And so what does that look like? It's usually small numbers. It's usually a dose escalation, and most often it's open label. Once you go to phase 2, More often, you're going to start seeing it blinded, although sometimes there's still open labels in an early phase 2 trial. And it is, if it isn't already the target population, it will now move to the target population. We're still worried about safety. You'll always monitor safety, and you can, but we're also now looking at efficacy. The outcomes in these studies will be the things that Dr. Enns mentioned. It could be clinical, it could be biomarker, there could be a surrogate marker that is involved that helps us know whether the disease is getting better or worse, something like ammonia, for example. So those are the things that we'll start seeing in phase 2. In phase 3, now this is the largest study. Sometimes in rare diseases, we combine them to these 3 into 2, and you call them a phase 1-2 early study, a phase 2-3 late study. So there may be a little bit of blending of these goals. But the goal of a phase 3 is now it will almost always be double blind. It will almost always be randomized. We do our best to keep those as placebo controlled, and it will be in the target populations. That has to be because we're going to be looking for efficacy. We'll always keep safety under observation, and if there's any signal that the drug is not safe, the study will be stopped. There's a data safety monitoring board, it's called, individuals knowledgeable about the study and the drug who are not part of the study will be looking at this independently in the background at many of these stop points, and will be able to stop the trial if there's concern about safety. If the drug passes this stage, the FDA looks at the results and says, yes, we agree, it is effective and it's safe, then what will happen is they'll approve the drug, but most often, because these are small studies, they'll move to a phase 4, which is often called a post-marketing study, and it's designed to look at longer-term outcomes. It gives the company the ability to go ahead and market the drug, so they could recover their investment in developing the drug, but it also puts them under obligation to follow up the study and make sure that everything is as it seemed in the smaller study. You'll often hear, even before you get into this, of natural history studies. Something that allows the FDA, the company, us who are doing the study to know what the outcome would have been without any treatment. It's a little hard to do in our diseases, and you know, the best natural history is the natural history that the physicians have in their files. The FDA hasn't really bought into that yet, so it's something that we're trying to work on, beyond the phase 4, you'll find that the companies will always be keeping an eye on the safety of their products, and so you may find long-term follow-up studies that you'll be able to participate in that are sort of beyond the scope of what the FDA has mandated. Oh, there it goes again. Look at that. One of these days, I'm going to remember to do that. So now we've got, you know what a clinical trial is, you know how it's designed, you know how it's going to be evaluated. The question is, why should you participate in a clinical trial? And I'm going to backtrack a little bit to talk to you about something unrelated, because it's extremely pertinent to this question. Back in the early 60s, childhood cancer was nearly universally fatal. There were a few survivors, but it was a terrible disease. Almost everybody with childhood cancer died. Currently, the overall 5-year survival, regardless of the type of cancer in childhood, is now 75%. And there are some cancers with a nearly 100% cure rate. That's remarkable. how did that happen? How do we get there with our metabolic disorders? Well, it happened by clinical trials. There's a group called a Children's Oncology Group, and it's now the predominant one that's doing clinical trials in cancer in kids. But there's also one that does it in adults. And basically, how this evolved was physicians got together and said, we have no idea how to treat this disease. Our patients are dying. How can we figure that out? So they formed these networks. These networks eventually coalesced to be this Children's Oncology Group. And the way they work is that every child in this country, and many countries worldwide for that matter, who's diagnosed with a cancer are given the option of joining a clinical trial. That clinical trial is standard of care plus one other thing. So you say, why would you do that? Well, if you're going to get standard of care, you're going to get standard of care. What if there's a drug that's better? That's standard of care plus one. That's a clinical trial. So probably 90% of kids, maybe even higher in the United States, are in a clinical trial. With cancer, I mean, they're going to try something over and above standard of care. And those things are, as I mentioned, they've already been through clinical trials. There's some reason to think they'll work. I'm sorry, preclinical trials. They've been through preclinical trials. It worked on cells. It worked in animals. We think it's going to do good things in kids. So what does that look like? I think that what we need to have in the United States, worldwide preferably, is that all individuals with rare diseases should have access to standard of care. Well, why would we do anything other than that? However, they should also all be offered enrollment in a clinical trial to compare standard of care with one other thing, one other variable. And so you heard about 4 clinical trials prior to this. You might be randomly assigned to one of those. You might be offered your choice of one or the other of those. But regardless of which it is, there's going to be constant feedback to coordinating centers to incorporate successful trials, successful changes to standard of care, and get rid of the ones that don't work. As soon as you prove a drug works, it becomes standard of care. Now you work on top of that. It may well be that one of those small molecules, one of those pill drugs, Hemashire or CoA Therapeutics, on top of a gene therapy is what's needed. On top of a liver transplant is what is needed. On top of whatever, and so this has been something that I've been trying to advocate for a couple of decades now, ever since I was president of the SIMD here in the United States, and we're still not there yet. So you do have to make your choice. But there are some national studies that are starting. I've just put some random names up here for companies, consortia that are out there. But the bottom line is that hopefully you'll consider a clinical trial. I'll just say that the thing that scares most people about clinical trials is this placebo thing. Well, I don't want the placebo. I want the real drug. It won't hurt and it might help. We don't know that. If we knew it worked, it would already be approved. And while we don't think it will hurt, we don't. If it hasn't been in people before, we never know that. And so that's why those early trials are so important. Another thing I hear a lot, well, I don't want my child to be a guinea pig. Oh, that's fair. And if you don't feel comfortable with a clinical trial, you should at least get standard of care. But keep in mind, it may not be that good. It may not be good enough. And you may want to consider the possibility that one of these drugs that's out there in clinical trials is going to be better than standard of care. If you feel comfortable with that, you should do a clinical trial. The last statement that I want my child, or I want to get the real treatment, not the placebo. That's kind of like that first bullet. We don't know what the real treatment is. We don't know whether this experimental drug is going to be better. We hope it won't be worse, but it might not be any better at all, in which case it's going to be exactly the same as the placebo. And so if you can't get over that, we're going to be stuck, because clinical trials provide the only mechanism for obtaining FDA approval for new treatment. That's it, period. End of sentence. If there are no FDA approved treatments for most of our rare diseases. There is no FDA approved drug for MMA or PA. When you say, well, I take Flagyl, well, that's not approved for FDA for it. We just use it. It's never been tested in a clinical trial. None of these drugs will come to approval without a clinical trial. And so if we don't have people participating in clinical trials, we won't have clinical trials, and we won't have any approved treatments. How do we get there? Well, participating in a clinical trial is a partnership. I know a lot about these clinical trials that Dr. Enns just described. He knows a lot about them. You need to know about them. And so what that means is working with folks like the Organic Acidemia Association, with other families, doing your own research on the internet, talking to your physician, talking to investigators. You have to know what a trial is doing, both in general. This is for propionic acidemia. Okay, that's for me. And specifically, it's meant to alter the CoA balance. Dr. Enns talked about that already. So you need to know that. Otherwise, you might say, well, hey, gee, I forgot to tell you, I have a liver transplant, right? Well, that means you can't do the gene therapy. Logistics. Do you have to travel? Do you have to be in the hospital? Are there any procedures involved? You don't want to go into these studies not understanding what's involved. You really ought to know the investigators, or at least know of the investigators. If you don't know them, ask your metabolic physician. Is that Vockley reputable? You know, what's he doing over there in Pittsburgh? I don't know anything about that and about them or that or their study. What can you tell me? And then you should feel free to ask to talk to the investigator. I speak to folks all the time who are interested in my clinical trials. And I'll even talk to them about the various clinical trials. I'm doing all 4 of those clinical trials that Dr. Enns discussed. How do I know which one is best for you? I talk to you about it. And I help you decide. I don't decide, you decide. And then finally, all of this information should be in the consent form. The procedures, the risks, the benefits, you should have all that in writing in front of you before you, and you should review it very carefully before you agree to participate in the study. All studies come with a right to refuse or withdraw without penalty. If it's my patients and they say, well, Dr. Vockley, I really am not comfortable doing that trial, that's fine. I continue to treat them as regardless. And then some trials, a lot of them come with some compensation. At the very least, they compensate you for your time and your effort, and any expenses. So, you know, ask about that. Participation in a clinical trial is a partnership, and if you don't have mutual trust, you're gonna fall back into that category of saying, well, I just don't really want to be a part of a clinical trial. Rare diseases are bumpy. There's just no other way to describe them. There are lots of ups and downs, and it's also true of clinical trials for rare diseases. They're difficult. They're hard diseases to treat. They're hard diseases to do clinical trials on. We all need to work together on it, and that's the only way we're going to get there. There are lots of barriers to success. they're expensive to do. There are financial challenges to doing these. Once you get a drug to market, the companies involved have spent tens of millions of dollars in getting those drugs there. But once you have a drug, once you're done with the clinical trial, it's approved, and it's not only approved for you, you've participated in that clinical trial, it's approved for everybody. So it benefits everybody. And that's the goal here. So all I can say is just do it. Take your time, look over the clinical trials that are available, but commit to yourself that you're going to participate, or you're going to work with your child to participate, because otherwise we're not going to ever have a drug to treat PA or MMA. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to try to stop. Did I stop sharing my screen already?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And I think Dr. Enns had to stop. I am. Yeah, he said he had to go.
And you have another call. You have another call coming up too. He had to be
on another meeting. I can hang on for another few minutes here if anybody has questions that you want to put in the chat, or feel free to unmute and heaven forbid even show your face. I'd be happy to see you and talk to you.
I've got a quick question. Now, when they are, if they do participate in the clinical trials, and then after it's done, are they able to continue taking that drug if it shows to some improvements, it shows to work?
Yeah, so most clinical trials are set up that way. It's something you have to ask about the specific clinical trial. That is, if you're in the double-blind placebo portion of the trial, usually what happens is once that portion is over, everybody is offered the opportunity to either stay on active drug if you were on it, you won't know, or move over to active drug if you were on the placebo and you won't know. And then so that's called the extension phase. And so one of the things you can ask when you're looking at clinical trials is about an open label extension phase. That's usually available. There are some trials where the drugs haven't been used long enough that the FDA will allow that to happen. But if there's some experience with it, basically that's not saying the drug is working. It's just saying they'll let you use it because it's safe to do it for a period of time. And
does insurance have to pay for that, or is that still part of the trial?
That is part of the trial. So that will continue to be covered, and you'll continue to go to the study site as part of the study if you go on an open label. Okay. Sorry, we had somebody who opened up there for a second. Did you have a question for me?
Feel free to, if you don't want to turn your camera on, you don't have to, or just unmute.
You can just ask if you're uncomfortable being on a camera. It's okay. Maybe that was the equivalent of the dog ate the homework. The dog hit the unmute button.
Yeah, maybe so. I'm sure maybe since this is recorded, others may have some questions, and I can always refer them to either contact you, or I can send you the questions and you can answer them.
Absolutely. If you're interested in one of these trials and you don't know who's close to you, or you're closer to Pittsburgh and you want to just come here, then we can get you the information regarding a trial, or all of them. As I said, I'm happy to talk to folks and try to help them weigh the relative risks and benefits of each of the trials. It's tough when there's a bunch out there, but boy, what a good problem to have, huh? 10 years
absolutely.
ago, 10 years ago we had nothing.
Right.
So this is the beginning of I hope a new era in treating our diseases.
And then you would encourage them to talk to their metabolic specialist.
At the very least, they should talk to their metabolic specialist. That's right. And their metabolic specialist may say, look, I know nothing about those trials. You're just going to have to go ahead and talk to one of the sites. Or they may say, oh yeah, I know that. I know that Vockley character. He's okay. You know, he's a little silly sometimes, which is what I always tell my pediatric patients. I just say, you can't have fun. Why not? Why do it? But
there is some qualifications. Even I mean, even if they fit the criteria initially, they may not.
You may not be eligible for one of a variety of reasons. Like, for example, with the gene therapy trials, you may be immune to the virus that's being used to that. They're natural viruses, and so the vector that's being used in the Logic Bio, about 10% of the general population actually is already immune to that virus. So if you can't participate in that study. You'll have to wait for another one, or you could try one of the other clinical trials. They don't aren't all interfered with by antibodies, so it's okay.
Right. So there are specific qualifications. Go ahead, Megan. You have a question.
Hi. Hi. I had a question about I don't know if you specifically know about each one, but the Moderna one that's for PA and or will they be offering it for MMA? Do you know?
We'll be offering it for MMA. It's actually an approved trial. It's ready to start. It got really slowed down by COVID. And you know, because Moderna was busy making about 3 billion doses of some other drug, and that kind of got in their way. So the MMA trial ought to be up and running pretty soon. I mean, like literally within, probably not weeks, but I would hope it's within a couple, 3 months. So that'll be available soon.
Great.
And they're open in the UK, I think, right?
They're open in the UK. They have one site that's been dosing. I think it's UK.
And about their other drug, do you know if our kids are allowed to get vaccinated, and then will they still be qualified for?
Yes, that will not, a COVID vaccine will not affect their antibody study to anything else. My caveat here is you should always talk to your physician or your metabolic physician but I have recommended to all of my patients that they get the vaccine. The risk of having a few hours one day of a bad reaction is where in a time and a place where we can define it, is way less than the risk of getting a very severe systemic infection that will be life-threatening.
That won't affect, you know, especially with the younger kids under 12, if they were signed up for the trial and got the vaccine before they, you know, or some week before. No,
I would. You should talk to the study site though. If that happens, the trials have built-in COVID response a little bit differently in each trial. I would recommend you get, if your kids are eligible for the vaccine, that they should get the vaccine as far in advance as they can of participating in the trial, so that it reduces their risk of, you know, going to a medical center and getting being part of a clinical trial. Once you have that vaccine, the risk for serious disease is very low. I see a couple. Let's see. Oh no, that was just one of our.
No questions in the chat. Anybody else have any other questions for Dr. Vockley about clinical trials? I'm sure this was very helpful, Dr. Vockley. I think a lot of people could probably watch this over and over again to kind of try to get it to seep into their brains, because it's a complicated process, and I
appreciate
it really
you spending. It does not come naturally, and so that's why I say talk to people you trust. Talk to your local team. I hope that my interactions with the OA group for the last 20 years, as I have it here. See, I got this at the last one.
Yeah, we gave him. They gave
me a
trophy.
little award. I love it. My 20 years. So it is. It's I live and breathe these diseases, and so I hope you also feel like you can trust me, and I'm happy to chat with folks as they make their decisions.
Yeah, I really think COVID kind of has a hold on a lot of people venturing out to explore these, but as long as we keep putting out the information, and then when they can talk to their doctors and make that decision, hopefully they'll be able to participate. And I wanted my daughter to participate, but she didn't qualify. So we'll just kick. Well, the one that's in our town anyway.
Okay. Well, come on out for a visit, Kathy. We'll take care of you.
That's right. I come to Pittsburgh. Guess I'll have to come to Pittsburgh, right?
Can I ask another question real quick?
Yeah.
Regarding the trials, if you're not in that area, or the one in your area, say they already have enough participants, are you able to go to different out of state?
Yeah, most of the trials don't limit the enrollment at a specific site. So if I happen to have a dozen patients with PA and they all want to enroll, usually I can get them in. But if there isn't somebody local, or for some reason your site isn't enrolling a particular trial, you can almost go anywhere you want.
They would go over like if they're only taking 10 patients. If they have 10 patients, you're saying they may take 11 patients.
Yeah, most of the time they'll
go over that.
You can talk to the company, and they're happy to let the investigator can go to the company and say, hey, I got somebody else wants to come to my site. But usually it's first come, first serve. So there usually is not not numbers restrictions. But as I say, if it isn't close to you, you can go to any site, and your expenses will be covered. You can so some of them do involve extended stays at various peak portions of the study, and so they'll put you up in a hotel, or a Ronald McDonald House, or an apartment, depending on the circumstances, and you'll get your travel paid, your meals paid. It's not great to be away from home, but at least your expenses will be paid if you have to be away from home.
Great. Well,
okay.
If anyone has any other questions, feel free to email me, or I can give you Dr. Vockley's email address, and he'll be happy to answer any more questions you might have. So I appreciate your taking your time, Dr. Vockley. I know you're busy, and I really appreciate you spending some time explaining this complicated topic.
My pleasure, and hopefully together we'll make these trials work. So, all right.
Absolutely.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.